1. Forging a Cosmo in the Marvel Universe. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. The Marvel Universe. June 15, 2012. Friday. New York City, Midtown School of Science and Technology. 17-year-old Hawk was drenched in sweat, pushing himself to the limit in the old gymnasium. Crack. Thwack. 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 A relentless series of brutal impacts echoed through the empty space. With every blow Hawk landed, the black heavy bag hanging from the ceiling swung wildly, its iron chain groaning under the strain. Hawk's hair was already plastered to his scalp. Sweat traced paths down his high cheekbones, over his clenched jawline, and finally dripped onto the collar of his worn, sweat-soaked t-shirt. But his eyes never left the bag. His focus was absolute. Right now, that heavy bag was his entire world. 9,951. 9,952. Quote. Hawk adjusted his footing, counting silently as he deftly weaved to the side, dodging the bag's returning swing. Without a moment's pause, a left hook, a right cross, every punch landed with solid, bone-jarring force. The bag shuddered violently under his storm of an assault, the leather on its surface looking more frayed and torn with each strike. Punch. Retract. Punch again. With every fist he threw, Hawk's movements seemed to accelerate. Faster and faster. Until 10,000. Boom. The fire in Hawk's eyes erupted in a blaze. The fist he'd just pulled back shot forward like a lightning strike, a viper's fang lashing out to slam into the heavy bag with pinpoint precision. The bag caved inward with a sickening thud, and the chain holding it finally gave out, snapping apart with a sharp crack. Freed from its restraint, the heavy bag flew backward, letting out a final, mournful whine before it slammed onto the gym floor with a thunderous crash. Crash. Ha! With the final punch of his 10,000 punch daily regimen complete, Hawk stared at the torn bag on the floor and finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding, his chest heaving as he steadied himself. Sweat flowed freely down his face, gathering at the tip of his chin before dripping onto the leg of his cheap sweatpants. Of course, cheap was a relative term. To anyone else, these $12 pants might be cheap, laughably so. But not to Hawk. After all, in this life, he was an orphan who had been reincarnated into the Marvel Universe. If it weren't for his decent grades, which had earned him a scholarship to Midtown Tech, he wouldn't have stood a chance. The tuition alone, tens of thousands of dollars each semester, was a bill he could never hope to pay. But even with the scholarship, Hawk still pinched every penny. It wasn't because he had a natural habit of being frugal, it was because his scholarship wasn't a full ride. It certainly wasn't the kind his classmate, the student aide Gwen Stacy, received. Gwen Stacy had landed the top-tier scholarship. Not only was her tuition completely covered, but the school also gave her a stipend each semester, not to mention the substantial prize money she won from various academic competitions. Hawk's scholarship was the most common type, a simple tuition waiver. After all, his grades were just good, not exceptional. But Hawk was more than satisfied with that. Midtown Tech waived his tuition, and because he was a federally recognized orphan over the age of 16 and under 18, a status known as transitional independence, he received a monthly stipend of $800. And since Midtown Tech was one of New York's elite schools, the state of New York kicked in another $500 a month. All told, he had a monthly income of $1,300. That kind of money wouldn't be enough for an adult living in New York City, but for Hawk, an orphan on federal aid with free tuition, it was enough. More than enough, actually. He ate his meals at school and slept in a low-income apartment provided by social services. From his $1,300 monthly stipend, he could cover his basic living expenses with $500 and still manage to save $800 a month. What? $500 isn't enough. Again, that's relative. It wouldn't be for an adult, but for Hawk, it was plenty. He finished his daily 10,000 punches in the gym every afternoon, showered there, and even washed his clothes in the locker room sink. Then, he'd catch the last free school bus home, go straight to sleep, and wake up to catch the first bus back to school the next morning. He had no utility bills, let alone a phone bill or an internet bill. He was an orphan. A oneman household. Who would he call, and who would call him? As for the internet, hey, he didn't even own a computer. Whenever he needed to get online, the school library had public computers, and even printing was free. So, even though this new life had started with him as an orphan again, Hawk felt like he was doing all right. He saved $800 a month and could even treat himself to a big bucket of fried chicken from a cheap joint every now and then to refuel. To date, he had already saved up over $30,000. Life was good. Of course. It would be even better if the fried chicken place wasn't in such a rough neighborhood. After a moment, Hawk, who had been standing with his eyes closed, slowly opened them. He stared at the heavy bag on the floor, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't looking at the bag, but at a prompt box floating in his vision. To be more precise, his cheat. Cosmo forging. Current status. Inactive. Activation condition. 10,000 punches a day, for 1,000 consecutive days. Activation progress. 999 1,000ths. Almost there. Almost. Tomorrow. It activates tomorrow. Hawk's heart pounded as he stared at the progress bar only he could see, wishing he could just fast forward time to the next day. This cheat had appeared when he turned 15 in this life. To be exact, it had shown up on September 10, 2009. He remembered the date perfectly. It was the day the Hulk had fought the abomination in Harlem. That was why he hadn't slacked off for a single second. The moment his power appeared, his training began. He had no choice. The world he'd been reborn into was the Marvel Universe, a world where superheroes were a dime a dozen, where superhuman beings were treated like stray dogs, and where cosmic gods ran rampant. Before he had this power, he could accept lying down and doing nothing. But now that he had it, how could he stay down? That would be a complete waste. And so, from the very day his power manifested, Hawk had maintained his routine of 10,000 punches a day. Not one day less. Come rain or shine, hell or high water. To put it simply, he could skip a meal. But he could never skip his training. And now, today, he had maintained this routine for 999 consecutive days. At last, the dawn of victory was finally within reach. MC image. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Hash bonus chapter every 100 PS. Hash if you like the story, please leave a review. Hash add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators thoughts. 27 comments 0 vote. 2. Flash Thompson and the Nerd Parker. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. 1,000 days. 2 years, 9 months, and 5 days. His daily task complete, Hawk stood under the hot spray of the gym's shower, once again summoning the interface that only he could see. He looked at the progress bar, just 1 day shy of completion, of activating his Cosmo forging. It still felt like a dream. After all, 10,000 punches a day, for 1,000 consecutive days without a single break, it's easy to say, but almost impossible to do. Sometimes, Hawk didn't even know how he'd manage to keep it up. Maybe it was just his personality, he never knew when to quit. Or maybe it had something to do with this world being the Marvel Universe. Hawk didn't know. But, one thing was certain. One day. Just one more day. After today, tomorrow would be the day he finally activated his power. Cosmo forging. I wonder if it's what I think it is. Hawk thought to himself. In his memory, only one thing came to mind when he thought of the word, Cosmo. If it really was what he was thinking of, then the future was looking bright. According to the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus, all things are composed of atoms. By that logic, the human body contained its own miniature universe. A Cosmo. To forge a Cosmo was to continuously ignite the primordial energy of one's own life force, awakening the hidden universe within. Through constant training, one could elevate their Cosmo, and by burning it, they could achieve a fighting power that transcended the laws of physics. Hawk remembered an anime from his past life that was based entirely on this concept. The name of that series was Saint Seiya. The Bronze Saints, who mastered the first 5 senses and could touch the 6th sense. The Silver Saints, who had awakened the 6th sense and could reach for the 7th. And then there were the Gold Saints, who had fully awakened and completely mastered the 7th sense. But beyond the 7th sense, there was an 8th, and even a 9th. Fragmented images of the series flickered through Hawk's mind. The next second, Hawk snapped back to reality, shaking his head with a slight smile. He didn't even know for sure if the Cosmo from his power was the same one from his memories. What was the point in overthinking it? Besides, He had no grand ambitions of punching out Odin or kicking Zeus in the teeth. Most importantly, he had already lived in this world for 17 years. Before his power even manifested at 15, he had already mentally prepared himself to face this brutal reality without any cheats at all. So, keep a level head. The higher the expectations, the greater the disappointment. With that thought, Hawk cleared his mind of distractions. He wrung out his freshly washed t-shirt and stuffed it into a plastic bag with his pants, then wrapped a towel around his waist. While drying his hair with another towel, he pushed open the door of the shower stall. Thump! The main door to the locker room burst open, and a skinny figure was shoved inside. The figure stumbled a few steps before his legs gave out, and he landed hard on the tiled floor. Is that Peter? Hawk raised an eyebrow, looking at the original Spider-Man, who had just been thrown in and was now sitting awkwardly on the ground. At that moment, Peter looked up and saw Hawk emerging from the showers. His expression was pure embarrassment. He was just about to say something to Hawk, a kid in his grade he'd never really talked to, when a chorus of laughter echoed from the doorway. A moment later, Flash Thompson, known by the nickname Flash, and the less flattering title of Midtown's top jock, strolled in, cradling a football. He was flanked by his three usual cronies. The next second, the laughter died. Hawk, who had just stepped out of the stall, was now toweling his wet hair with one hand and holding the plastic bag of clothes with the other, a towel secured around his waist. As soon as Flash entered, his gaze locked onto him. Flash Thompson was a big guy, built like a linebacker. But Hawk was no slouch either. 999 days of non-stop training, of throwing 10,000 punches a day, had forged a physique of dense, powerful muscle. And this wasn't the kind of puffed-up muscle you saw from guys at a commercial gym. The lines of his arms were defined with pure, functional strength, not bloated and showy, but lean and explosive. The towel was cinched low on his waist, creating a slight indent above his hip bones that only accentuated his narrow, toned core. The outline of his abs was clearly visible, an eight-pack arranged like carefully sculpted armor. Their eyes met. For a moment, the air in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knows the score. In American high schools, there's a clear pecking order, a food chain of sorts. Logically, Hawk, an orphan with no parents and no money, should have been at the very bottom, a prime target. But he wasn't. It wasn't because he had ever fought the school's bullies and earned their respect. The reason no one messed with him was much simpler. Because, whether it was his looks or his build, nothing about him screamed, easy target. Of course, in the 3 years he'd been doing this, the school's jocks had never bothered him, and he had never felt the need to play hero for anyone else. Everyone fights their own battles. This time was no different. Hawk broke eye contact. He walked over to the bench, pulled a clean t-shirt and jeans from his backpack, and got dressed. After stuffing the plastic bag inside, he slung the backpack over one shoulder and walked directly toward Flash Thompson, who was blocking the exit. Flash frowned, watching Hawk approach him. He knew who Hawk was. It was hard not to notice the guy who spent every single day in the corner of the gym, throwing 10,000 punches at a heavy bag for over 2 years. But he didn't know him. Not really. Hawk never went to parties or hangouts. Despite seeing him at school every day, it was like he was living in a parallel universe. Flash watched as Hawk stopped right in front of him. Excuse me. Quote. Flash instinctively stepped aside. His three friends behind him looked like they were about to say something, but the moment their eyes met Hawk's, a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed completely indifferent to everything around them, they followed their instincts and shuffled out of the way too. Thanks. Hawk gave a nod to Flash for clearing the path, his voice calm and even, before walking out of the locker room without a second glance. Flash stared after Hawk's retreating back, a frown on his face, lost in thought. Just then, one of his cronies gasped. Holy shit. Flash, Parker's gone. What? Flash snapped out of it. He saw Peter Parker slipping out the door right behind Hawk, and it finally clicked. Get him, he roared. Parker, you get your nerdy ass back here. Quote. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 23 comments 0 vote. 3. Tonight, the universe will shine for him. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. After leaving the old gymnasium, Hawk headed for the parking lot. He had no idea what happened behind him. Then again, even if he did, he wouldn't have cared. Spider-Man might be the most famous comic book character in the world, but honestly, Hawk didn't know Peter at all. Even if they were in the same grade. By the time Hawk arrived at the parking lot with his bag slung over his shoulder, the doors of the last orange school bus were already open. A burly, bearded driver in a school staff uniform was slumped over the steering wheel, fiddling with a portable radio. "Afternoon, Mr. Hall," Hawk said politely as he stepped onto the bus. "Anything interesting on the news today?" The bearded Mr. Hall looked intimidating as hell. But he wasn't. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was a good guy. Still talking about that federal building collapse in Quantico. They're saying it was a terrorist attack. Mr. Hall looked up from his radio as Hawk boarded, then glanced at his watch. "You're 2 minutes later than yesterday, Hawk." Hawk shrugged. "Sorry, the shower took a little longer today. Good thing I know you catch my bus home every day, otherwise I'd have already pulled up to the main gate. Go on, take a seat. We're heading out." "You got it." Hawk kept his tone respectful, heading toward the back of the bus with his backpack. Mr. Hall started the engine, ready to close the doors and drive to the main student pickup area. Just then, Peter came sprinting out of nowhere, squeezing onto the bus just as the doors were about to shut. Mr. Hall jumped in his seat. Holy! He caught himself, swallowing the curse word before it could escape. He looked at the gasping, out-of-breath Peter, then passed him to Flash Thompson and his crew, who had just run up to the bus. Flash and his friends didn't get on. They just stood outside, glaring at Peter. Mr. Hall's gaze flickered between Peter on the bus and Flash outside. He frowned at Flash and called out, "Hey, you getting on or not?" Flash shot a look at Mr. Hall, said nothing, then turned and walked away with his cronies in tow. Bullying a classmate was one thing. Doing it right in front of a staff member was something else entirely. He was a jock, not an idiot. Peter wasn't an idiot either. As soon as Mr. Hall closed the doors, he mumbled a, "Thank you," to the driver. Mr. Hall glanced at him but didn't reply. He knew what was going on, but as long as it didn't happen on his bus, it wasn't his problem. Anywhere else. He was just a bus driver. It wasn't his business, and it wasn't his job to get involved. Peter didn't say anything else. He turned to find a seat and saw Hawk sitting in the very back, by the window. After a moment's hesitation, he walked over. "Thanks." Quote. Hawk, who had been staring out the window, lost in thought about what the next day would bring, turned his head. He looked at Peter standing in the aisle with a completely neutral expression. "I didn't do anything for you. You don't have to thank me." With that, he turned his gaze back to the window, dismissing Peter completely. He had no idea if this version of Peter had his powers yet. Most likely, he hadn't become the Spider-Man from his memories. But, even if he had, Hawk wanted nothing to do with him. To be more precise, he wanted nothing to do with any superhero. Superhero sounded great in theory, but in reality, the title was inextricably linked to one disaster after another. Before he had his power, he never had any intention of chasing after them. He just wanted to live a long life. Having been given a second chance, the least he could do was live to a ripe old age. The plan had been to study hard, do well, and maybe build a comfortable life for himself. Now that his power was here, Hawk's core mission hadn't changed. It had just evolved. The goal of living a comfortable life had become living a longer and even more comfortable life. But the prerequisite for achieving either goal was the same. In a word, stay the hell out of the superheroes' messes. So, even after he'd started school and learned who Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy were, he never had any desire to get to know them. Gwen was a different story, though. He couldn't avoid her. She was the student aide for the entire 11th grade. But dating Gwen Stacy, the girl known as the #1 love interest in all of comics. Hawk had no interest. At least, not right now. He wasn't in a position to even think about things like love. Peter watched Hawk turn back to the window. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but after a moment, he thought better of it, closed it, and took a seat on the opposite side of the aisle. Soon, the bus reached the main gate. Mr. Hall opened the doors, and the rest of the students waiting for the last free bus of the day piled on. The quiet atmosphere was instantly replaced by a cacophony of chatter. An hour later, the bus arrived in Jackson Heights. Mr. Hall opened the doors and smiled as Hawk stood by the exit. See you tomorrow, Hawk. See you, Mr. Hall. Hawk returned the farewell politely and stepped off the bus. He walked toward a nearby 5-story, old-fashioned apartment building with a faded, orange brick facade. The pre-war building was owned by the New York City Housing Authority. Hawk's apartment was on the 5th floor. It wasn't large, but it had one major perk. He could easily access the building's rooftop via the fire escape outside his window. Soon. Back home, Hawk dropped his backpack on a table. He took out the plastic bag with his clean clothes, grabbed a couple of hangers, opened the window, and climbed up the fire escape to the roof. After hanging his clothes on a makeshift line, Hawk walked to the edge of the roof. He leaned his hands on the low parapet and looked up, watching the planes that occasionally streaked across the sky as they prepared to land at or take off from nearby LaGuardia Airport. Feeling the wind and counting planes. It was one of the few hobbies he had that helped him relax. Lately, though, he'd added a new one. Stargazing. Night fell. Hawk sat on the ground, leaning his back against the building's ventilation shaft. He enjoyed the cool summer breeze as he gazed up at the stars that had begun to emerge in the twilight sky. The cosmos was vast. The stars, countless. Maybe it was just his imagination. But for the past 6 months, as he continued his daily regimen of 10,000 punches, Hawk had felt a growing connection to the vast expanse above. Tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. Constellations that had been blurry to the naked eye just last night were now stunningly, impossibly clear. Pegasus, Draco, Cygnus, Andromeda, Phoenix, Lacerta. The 48 constellations, each symbolizing one of the 48 bronze saints, were laid out before his eyes. It was as if, tonight, the entire universe would shine for him. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. 4. Burn, my Cosmo. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Midnight passed. On the rooftop of the apartment building, Hawk was throwing punches. There was no heavy bag. No specific martial arts technique. Hawk wasn't even moving from his spot. He just stood there, eyes slightly closed, as if in a trance, striking the empty air with one fist after another. This time, he wasn't chasing speed. Instead, he seemed to have fallen into a state of profound enlightenment. Though he had felt a strange sensation with every punch before, tonight, it was infinitely stronger. Hawk felt as if he had entered a dimension of absolute darkness, infinite from every conceivable angle. But, with every punch he threw, a flicker of light would bloom within that endless void. If Hawk had looked up right then, he would have noticed something even more miraculous. Because the constellations dotting the night sky, the ones he could now see with his naked eye, Pegasus, Draco, Cygnus, Phoenix, Lacerta, all 48 bronze constellations were flickering in response to his every strike. Yes, not a single constellation, but all of them. All 48 bronze constellations were answering his call. One punch, then another, and another. This time, Hawk's movements were slow, yet impossibly fast. Though he fully retracted his fist after each blow before throwing the next, the afterimage of the first punch would still be lingering in the air as the afterimage of the second appeared. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, until now. The air was filled with a storm of phantom fists. Just then, a deafening roar thundered through Hawk's mind. It was a sound that was both silent and as loud as a colossal bell. Boom! A single spark ignited within the void. As it appeared, the stars reflected in that infinite space, a mirror of reality itself, began to ripple outwards, gently parting the thick curtain of darkness. At first, it was just a tremor. Then, that tremor exploded, like the first moment of the Big Bang. The stars adorning the infinite darkness detonated in a brilliant flash. Inside Hawk's body, an invisible, intangible barrier shattered under the force of this cosmic explosion. A power that had slumbered for eons was violently awakened. Whoosh! Hawk's eyes snapped open. As they did, the flame deep within them no longer flickered and died as it had before. This time, it ignited into a raging inferno. Roar! Hawk felt the blood roaring through his veins, every single cell in his body vibrating with an insane energy, as if 10,000 stars were expanding at once. Under this violent, expansive shockwave, every inch of his being, every bone, was shattered and pulverized, only to be instantly reforged by the terrifying, starbirthing power. VMMMM. A high-pitched hum filled Hawk's ears. His vision blurred, then cleared to reveal an impossible sight. He saw the very particles of his flesh spinning, burning, and collapsing, reenacting the universe's first moments. He saw the blood flowing beneath his skin, a roaring, boiling river of stars. He saw his own beating heart, each pulse echoing the primordial, eternal rhythm of creation, sending invisible ripples through the infinite void. The next moment, instinct took over. Hawk clenched his right fist, ground his heel into the rooftop, and pivoted, shattering the concrete beneath his feet as he shifted his entire body weight back. He drew back. And then, he unleashed the punch. A low growl tore from him, a sound not from his throat, but from the very explosion of his soul. Burn, my Cosmo. Boom. The surrounding air blasted outwards like a shockwave on water. The space around him shattered like glass. The very flow of time was violently torn to shreds. Air and even space seemed to freeze in the face of Hawk's punch. The next second, hiss SS. The air screamed as it was ripped apart. Crack. Space shrieked as it was crushed into dust. Crack-o-oom. Time itself was annihilated by the blow. But in that same instant, a new timeline seamlessly replaced the one that had been destroyed. Pop, pop, pop. Across the street, the windows on the apartment building facing Hawks exploded outwards from the force of the punch, shattering into a deafening cascade of splintered glass. Crunch. Weewoo. Weewoo. The cars parked along the street below were violently slammed downwards as if crushed by a giant, invisible hand from the sky. Their windows burst, and one after another, their alarms began to shriek into the morning air. At the same time, Kamar Taj. Master. The sorcerers of the sanctum looked toward the sorcerer supreme, who had just made a quiet, puzzled sound. The Ancient One, clad in her yellow robes, looked down at the holy relic hanging from her neck, the Eye of Agamotto. Her hands formed a mystic gesture. The Eye of Agamotto slowly began to rotate, then opened, unleashing a spectral green light from the mysterious, arcane gem nestled within. This gem had a common name in the Marvel Universe. The Time Stone. It allowed its wielder to travel to any point in time, past or future, no matter how distant. The Time Stone controlled all timelines, known and unknown. To control the stone was to control time itself. What is this? The future has been altered. The Ancient One formed another gesture, closing the Eye of Agamotto. She then rose to her feet and vanished from the sanctum. Ding. Congratulations, you have activated Cosmo Forging. Ding. It has been my honor to accompany you for these 1000 days. The system will now unbind. I look forward to our next encounter. Finally, the path of Cosmo Forging is the path of combat, the path of holy war. Grow in battle, and in battle, you will ascend. Goodbye. The system's mechanical voice echoed one last time in Hawk's mind. 1,000 days ago, it had arrived in silence. 1,000 days later, it departed just as quietly. It came without a sound. It left without a trace. By now, the sun was rising. Holy shit. What the hell happened? My windows. Ah, my car. Who the hell did this? Wait a second. Look, up there. What is that? Holy shish. Jesus Christ. Standing on the rooftop, Hawk listened to the chaotic symphony of voices rising from the street below. He slowly opened his eyes and saw it, a gaping wound torn in the sky above Manhattan, glowing with an ethereal blue light. Hawk froze. Hiss. Did my last punch just tear a hole in the sky? Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators thoughts. 12 comments 0 vote. 5 tearing a hole in the New York sky. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Hawk stared, stunned, at the sky above Manhattan, a sky that had been ripped open, exposing the infinite blackness beyond. An ethereal blue beam of light shot upwards, pulsing into the terror in reality, as if it were forcing open a gateway. The edges of the portal, torn open by some unseen, violent hand, crackled and hissed with raw, blue energy. Hawk instinctively glanced down at his right fist. But, the next second, he realized his mistake. No, he hadn't torn the sky open. The space stone had. 2012. The Chitauri invasion. The timeline clicked into place in his mind. In a flash, his eyes snapped back to the gaping wound in the sky. Just as he thought. As the portal stabilized high above Manhattan, a metallic swarm of Chitauri soldiers began to pour through, spilling into the sky like a plague of locusts. A sudden, violent flood. The Chitauri soldiers, riding sleek, singleman flyers that glinted with a cold, metallic sheen, descended upon the city. The engines of their craft whined with a high-pitched, grating hum, their alien bodies encased in dark, alloyed armor. Krakoom. The first Chitauri soldier squeezed the trigger of its energy rifle. The glass curtain wall of a Manhattan skyscraper instantly shattered, exploding outwards in a shower of glittering shards. Scree. Attack. Invasion. Invasion. Kill them all. The swarming Chitauri shrieked with bloodlust. As they poured from the wormhole, they quickly broke off into their designated attack wings. Some soldiers banked their flyers low, streaking toward the streets of Manhattan. Others climbed higher, then veered off, heading toward Brooklyn after locking onto their targets. And, of course, Queens was also in their line of fire. Holy shit. What is that? Are those aliens? Is this an invasion? They're coming this way. Hiss. Oh my god. Run. Ah. Just like Manhattan, which had already descended into chaos, the residents of Queens erupted into terrified screams. They watched as the Chitauri descended, firing their energy weapons indiscriminately, blasting through buildings, incinerating cars, and cutting down civilians. People scattered, running in any direction they thought was safe. The guttural shrieks of the Chitauri. The shattering of skyscrapers. The roar of exploding cars. The final screams of the fallen, mixed with the panicked shouts of the fleeing. In that moment, the entire city of New York was plunged into absolute terror. Standing on the rooftop, Hawk's first instinct was to turn and run back into his apartment. But, the moment he turned, he froze. A thought struck him. He slowly turned back around and looked up at the sky, at the swarm of Chitauri soldiers that was now descending upon Queens like a tidal wave. One of the soldiers, piloting its flyer and screeching as it flew, spotted Hawk standing on the rooftop. For an invader, there was nothing more satisfying than watching the terrified masses scream and flee from their slaughter. So, while everyone else was running for their lives, Hawk just stood there, completely still. It was impossible not to notice him. Their eyes met. In the depths of Hawk's piercing blue eyes, a single star seemed to flicker. Human. The Chitauri soldier locked its gaze with Hawk's. The reptilian eyes hidden behind its dark metal faceplate seemed to receive a signal. It broke off from its squadron, banking its flyer and diving straight for the rooftop where Hawk stood. It opened fire immediately. A destructive ball of energy gathered at the front of the flyer, coalescing in an instant before shooting directly at Hawk. Hawk watched the energy blast rapidly expand in his vision, his pupils constricting. Boom. The blast slammed into the rooftop, shattering the concrete and sending a cloud of dust into the air. The Chitauri soldier saw Hawk move at the last second, reappearing on the other side of the rooftop completely unscathed. Without a flicker of emotion, it pulled the trigger again. Pew. 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 Boom. The apartment rooftop was turned into a war zone, rocked by a relentless barrage of energy blasts from the Chitauri soldier. Shrapnel flew. Dust choked the air. Hawk's figure weaved through the chaos, dodging one energy blast after another. He moved with impossible speed, a blur against the backdrop of explosions. At first, Hawk had felt a surge of panic, but now, he was calm, moving with a fluid grace that felt entirely natural. It had taken him less than a minute to adapt. A saint, after all, is born for war. The Chitauri soldier fired again and again. Click click clank. With a final, hollow sound, the soldier's barrage stopped. It looked down at its weapon, seeing the empty energy clip on its flyer. Just then, a whistling sound cut through the air. The Chitauri soldier looked up. A jagged piece of a steel water tank shot out from the dust cloud and, crunch, slammed into its flyer. The impact sent the flyer into a violent spin. The Chitauri soldier was thrown from its seat and, with a clumsy flail, fell from the sky. Thud. The soldier crashed onto the rooftop, but it was back on its feet in an instant, pulling a rifle-like weapon from its back, powered by the same eerie, green energy source. HSSSSKSSKSs. The Chitauri soldier made an indescribable, guttural sound, perhaps it was speaking, or perhaps it was communicating with its hive. Hawk didn't understand what it was doing, and he didn't much care. After all, this was a fight. Time to get serious. The rooftop was a wreck. After the Chitauri's relentless assault, it was barely recognizable. It hadn't collapsed completely, but it was close. Large sections of the roof had caved in, some falling all the way down to the third floor, exposing the apartments below. But no one was paying attention to what was happening on the roof. New Yorkers were experts at one thing above all else: survival. Hardened by years of crime waves and terrorist threats, they had perfected the art of running for their lives without a second thought the moment danger appeared. The dust on the rooftop began to settle. Soon, Hawk's figure became visible again. The Chitauri soldier saw him emerge. A cold light flashed in its green, reptilian eyes as it instantly pulled the trigger. Die. Quote. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 7 comments 0 vote. 6 Hawk, the jack of all trades. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Crack. The Chitauri soldier, still frozen in its firing stance, felt its head snap 90 degrees to the side. Its compound, fly-like eyes, glowing with that eerie green light, stared in disbelief at Hawk, who was now standing in front of it. How did he suddenly get behind me? The Chitauri soldier didn't understand. But it didn't need to. That was the last thought it would ever have. An instant later, an endless darkness consumed it. The soldier's lifeless body crumpled to the rooftop, its energy weapon slipping from its grasp and clattering to the ground. That's it. Hey. Hawk looked down at the soldier whose neck he'd just broken and let out a short, dismissive laugh. The next second, he felt it. Deep within the Cosmo that had been born from that internal Big Bang, a warm current of energy surged as the Chitauri soldier died. As this energy flowed into him, it was as if a single star had just been ignited in his personal universe. At the same time, with the lighting of this star, a wave of information washed over him. The ghostly outlines of the 48 bronze constellations, which had been shimmering within his Cosmo, became slightly more defined as the first star flared to life. Hawk closed his eyes, absorbing the information his Cosmo was feeding him. To grow in countless battles. To ascend in endless combat. After all, the path of the Cosmo was born for war, forged for holy crusades. It was the art of battle, the way of the saint. So, if I want to light up my own constellations within my Cosmo, I need to fight. I need to keep fighting. In the lore of the saints, the awakening of one's Cosmo was deeply tied to their guardian constellation, but it wasn't a simple one-to-one relationship. If an awakened Cosmo was the liquid, then the constellation was the vessel. The constellation was the symbol of a saint's identity and the container for their power. The bad news. In the Marvel universe, there were no saints. So, if he wanted a guardian constellation of his own, he would have to ignite them, one by one, through his own efforts. The good news. Because there were no saints in the Marvel universe, then theoretically, he could awaken all 48 of the bronze constellations. It wasn't like in the old stories, where tens of thousands of warriors would fight and die just for the chance to claim a single constellation, with only one emerging as the victor. In those stories, the constellations were few, but the warriors were many. But here, it was different. Here, he was the only one who had awakened a Cosmo. So, he could be the Pegasus Saint, or he could be the Phoenix Saint. He could be any of them, as long as he could ignite their stars within his Cosmo. And that was awesome. He was going to take them all. Wait a minute. If he could claim all 48 bronze constellations, what about the 24 silver constellations? And the 12 zodiacs of gold? Hiss. The thought struck Hawk with the force of a physical blow, and he drew in a sharp breath. Just then, he heard the whistle of air cutting above him. His eyes snapped open to see 2 more Chitauri soldiers on their flyers. They had seen the body of their fallen comrade at his feet and immediately locked onto him. Without a word, they opened fire. Pew, pew, pew. Enraged at the sight of their ally killed by a weak human, the 2 Chitauri soldiers unleashed a torrent of energy blasts, pouring their fury down onto the rooftop. Under their combined assault, the already crumbling rooftop finally gave way. With a deafening groan, the roof of the apartment building collapsed. The entire structure began to shudder. Soon, as the two Chitauri circled, relentlessly firing, the building began to fail, collapsing in on itself from the top down. The ground seemed to tremble. With a massive plume of dust and debris, the 5-story apartment building was reduced to a pile of rubble. Some of the residents who had managed to escape the building just before it collapsed, but hadn't gotten far, now stood frozen, their mouths agape as they stared at the ruin. But their shock was short-lived. The two Chitauri soldiers descended, appearing before them. They snapped out of their trance. Seeing the inhuman soldiers, they screamed and turned to run. But it was too late. Their orders from the mothership were simple: kill all humans. Seeing the fleeing civilians, the Chitauri didn't hesitate. They pulled their triggers once again. A storm of exploding energy blasts. A street of falling bodies. In the blink of an eye, the already impoverished, rundown street was transformed into a war zone, looking like something straight out of a battle-scarred city. After clearing out the civilians, the two Chitauri soldiers dismounted from their flyers. They drew their energy rifles and aimed them at the pile of rubble that was once the apartment building. They had realized something. The life signal of the human who had killed their comrade was still active. Not only was it not weakening, it was growing stronger. Stronger and stronger. The two Chitauri exchanged a look. The next second, boom, the rubble exploded outwards, and a blur of motion shot out. The Chitauri soldier on the right vanished. A split second later, a thunderous crack echoed through the street. The soldier was now plastered against the wall of the building across the road, spread out like a grotesque mural. Eerie green blood flowed down the bricks. The remaining Chitauri soldier stared, its eyes wide, at the sudden fate of its partner. But its eyes were too small. No matter how wide it tried to open them, they still looked like little green beads. It instinctively started to run toward its splattered comrade, but it didn't get more than a few steps. It saw a flash of movement, and then its entire body was launched backward. Only then did the sound of the impact reach its ears. Boom. Crack. The Chitauri soldier's chest caved in midair. It flew through the air like a ragdoll before crashing into the pile of rubble. Its body bounced once off the debris before settling into the ruins. It didn't move again. Pa. Hawk appeared where the second soldier had been standing. He casually dusted off his clothes while looking around with a curious expression. He killed one Chitauri, and 2 more showed up. Now he'd killed these 2. So, 3 should be coming next, right? Hawk thought to himself, then looked up toward Manhattan, at the colossal leviathan that was now descending from the portal. His eyes burned with anticipation. He was ready for more. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 21 comments, 0 vote. 7. The main front and the queen's side show. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. In the end, Hawk suppressed the burning urge inside him and chose not to join the chaos on the main front in Manhattan. The Leviathan, a biomechanical war machine belonging to the Chitauri, was an impossibly massive creature, its entire body plated in thick, alloyed armor as it roared out of the portal. Leaving aside the question of whether he could even hurt the thing, the sheer size difference was like comparing an ant to a mountain. Besides, if he had his saint armor, maybe he would have considered crashing the party. But for now, it was better to pass. Queens had more than enough Chitauri swarming around. There was no need to rush off to Manhattan. That was the original Avengers battlefield, not his. He was stronger now. But that was all. He was just stronger. Awakening his Cosmo was just the beginning, the starting point. It wasn't the destination, nor the end of his journey. So, Hawk went nowhere. He didn't even go on the offensive. Instead, he found a spot right in front of his ruined home, hunkering down to wait for the inevitable. He was an angler waiting for the fish to bite, knowing the Chitauri in the area would get the message about their fallen comrades and come looking for payback. This was a hell of a lot easier than chasing them down himself. After all, the Chitauri could fly. He couldn't. Most importantly, his apartment building was in a poor neighborhood. What does that mean, exactly? Let's just say, it took an ambulance at least half an hour to get there after a 911 call. In a wealthy Manhattan neighborhood, the response time was 3 minutes, tops. The same went for surveillance. In the rich parts of town, there was probably a dedicated camera pointed at every single trash can in every alley. Here, there weren't even cameras on the main streets. And even if there were, they wouldn't last a day before some local kids figured out how to strip them for parts. Soon, hiding in the shadows, Hawk saw them. Two Chitauri soldiers on flyers, drawn by the death signals of their allies, streaked through the sky nearby. Hawk's eyes lit up. 2 minutes later. Thump. Thump. On the ruins of the apartment building, two more ugly corpses joined the two Hawk had already arranged neatly, almost as if for display. Sensing the deaths of their pilots, the two now empty flyers automatically turned and flew off in a single direction. Hawk watched them go, then silently retreated back into the shadows. A minute later, detecting a sharp spike in Chitauri casualties in Queens, a signal was broadcast down from the command ship lurking within the wormhole above Manhattan. The next moment, a nearby squad of Chitauri soldiers, who had been unleashing hell, screeching with glee as they destroyed buildings, cars, and people, all stopped. They received the new signal and immediately changed course, converging on the source of the silent alarms now ringing out across Jackson Heights. They had been ordered to engage. The Chitauri squad shrieked as they formed up behind their leader. He was taller and more heavily built than the others, even his flyer looked more menacing. He led them over the neighborhood and into the sky above the destroyed street. Instantly, they saw them, the broken bodies of their four comrades, laid out in a neat row on the rubble of the apartment building. Skikiki. HSSSSSSSs. The Chitauri captain and his 6 soldiers seemed to freeze in midair at the sight of their dead. A second later, as if they'd received new orders, they came back online. The engines of their flyers roared back to life. In seconds, the captain and his soldiers spread out, forming a circle in the sky above the street. Then, with cold, emotionless eyes like reptiles, they squeezed the triggers on their flyers' energy cannons without hesitation. In an instant, a storm of energy blasts rained down, a net of pure destruction covering the entire street block in a carpet-bombing run. Boom. 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 The buildings on the street exploded. The asphalt buckled and cracked. The cars still on the road detonated in secondary fireballs. Hovering in their circle, the Chitauri fired relentlessly, their expressions blank, their claws locked on the triggers like machines. They didn't stop until the entire block was choked with smoke and fire, until their flyers' energy cells were completely depleted, and until their captain finally ceased his assault. Only then, like a perfectly synchronized machine, did they all release their triggers at once. The entire block was now nothing but a smoldering ruin. Crumbling skeletons of old apartment buildings. Burning cars that occasionally popped and exploded. The place now looked more war-torn than any battlefield. The Chitauri captain, still seated on his flyer, scanned the silent, lifeless ruins with his slightly larger, green-bed eyes. Satisfied, he turned away, having received his next orders to withdraw. Under such a powerful and overwhelming barrage, no life form could have possibly survived. And so, the Chitauri mothership, monitoring through the soldiers' eyes, issued the new directive to the captain. As the captain turned, his 6 soldiers began to follow, banking their flyers to leave. But just as they turned their backs, one of the soldiers on its flyer suddenly arched backward violently, its body bending like a cooked shrimp. With a sickening squelch, its armored chest exploded from the inside out. The next second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Before the remaining soldiers could even react, they all suffered the exact same fate. The moment they turned their backs to the street, their chests detonated, leaving a fist-sized hole clean through their torsos. The wounds were ripped from back to front, as if they had each been punched straight through the spine. Almost in perfect sync with the 6 soldiers' chests exploding, 6 thunderous sonic booms finally caught up, tearing through the air. Boom. Boom. The Chitauri captain, who had been turning just as his 6 squad mates were obliterated, heard the sonic booms rip past his ears. His head snapped up mechanically. Without a shred of hesitation, he threw himself sideways, leaping from his flyer. The next instant, his custom, menacing-looking flyer, now empty, was struck by something unseen and vaporized in a massive explosion. Boom. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 8 comments, 0 vote. 8 My fate is my own. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Hawk had no idea how other saints trained. The ones he remembered were from an anime, after all. This was reality. And as everyone knows, stories need logic. Reality doesn't. And so, Hawk, who had thrown 10,000 punches a day for 1,000 consecutive days, had long since mastered this simple movement to the point of perfection. What was that Bruce Lee saying? I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. Hawk had thrown and retracted his fist more than 10,000 times. Now that he had completed the activation of his Cosmo, that simple punch had undergone a fundamental transformation. The sonic fist. It was a technique that allowed his punches to reach the speed of sound. By burning his Cosmo, he could even shatter that barrier. What does that mean? It means that by the time you feel the impact of my fist, you will only then hear the sound of me throwing it. That is the sonic fist. Boom. As the flyer exploded in the sky above, the Chitauri captain, who had jumped to safety at the last possible second, heard the sonic boom rip past his ears. He pulled a weapon from his back, a spear-like weapon that glowed with the same eerie green light, and fixed his gaze on Hawk, who now stood before him, barek-chested, his physique like that of a Greek statue. It couldn't be helped. During the Chitauri's carpet bombing, Hawk had been unharmed, but the t-shirt he'd worn for years had been shredded by flying debris. It didn't matter. Now, dressed only in a pair of gray sweatpants and old sneakers, Hawk felt even stronger. And it wasn't an illusion. Everyone knows the rule. A little battle damage is a power-up. Human. The Chitauri captain gripped its glowing energy spear, its oversized greenbed eyes locked on Hawk from behind its faceplate. On a monitor aboard the Chitauri mothership, deep within the wormhole, Hawk's image now appeared. Hawk looked at the captain and its glowing spear and cracked a slight, crooked smile. The next second, he extended his right hand, palm open, then curled his fingers, beckoning the Chitauri captain forward. No more words were needed. Come on. You will die. The Chitauri captain, seeing Hawk's dismissive expression and insulting gesture, remained emotionless. With a crack, it stomped its foot, shattering the ground, and launched itself forward like a missile. As it closed the distance, the tip of its spear glowed, firing off a volley of energy blasts. Hawk pushed off the ground as well. The asphalt beneath his feet spider-webbed and collapsed as he shot forward, transforming into a streak of golden light that tore through the air, directly at the Chitauri captain. In his memories, once a bronze saint awakened their Cosmo, earned the recognition of their guardian constellation, and donned their saint armor, their bodies became terrifyingly powerful. Their durability was incredible. Their punches and movements reached the speed of sound. Even their lifespans far exceeded that of a normal human. Although Hawk had only just awakened his Cosmo, had yet to ignite a single constellation, and didn't even have a hint of a saint armor, it didn't change the fact that, in a very real sense, he was no longer human. And so, squelch. The Chitauri captain, who had been rocketing toward Hawk, trying to pin him down with ranged attacks before closing in for the kill, suddenly froze. Its expression twisted, and it coughed up a spray of green blood. The force of the eruption was so violent it blew the metal faceplate clean off, revealing the grotesque, insectoid face beneath. The next moment, the sound of the punch arrived, exploding next to the captain's ear. Boom. The Chitauri captain dazedly looked down, seeing the arm that had punched clean through its hardened armor and was now buried in its chest. It let out an incomprehensible, gurgling shriek, trying to lift its impossibly heavy head to get one last look at the human who had killed it in a single blow. But, it was out of time. Just as it raised its head, the arm was pulled from its chest, and an infinite darkness consumed it. Thud. Without Hawk's arm to support it, the Chitauri captain collapsed to the ground like a dead insect. As the captain fell, Hawk casually hooked his finger, catching the energy spear before it could hit the ground. A green, liquid-like energy flowed within the weapon, causing the spear to glow. Hawk hefted the spear in his hand. A thought suddenly occurred to him. If he were to sell this energy spear, and the other rifles from the soldiers he killed, on the black market, how much would they be worth? Alien weaponry. That had to be valuable, right? Thinking this, Hawk instinctively glanced toward a corner of the ruined apartment building. When he had been arranging the bodies, he'd tossed the 4 energy rifles he'd collected into a large crater. Just then, a brilliant flash of blue light from the direction of Manhattan caught his eye. He snapped his head up. He looked toward the sky over the city. The colossal pillar of blue light that had stretched from earth to sky was gone. At the same time, the tear in the sky was closing at a visible rate. That's it. It's over. The Chitauri invasion event is already finished. Somehow it feels. Hawk blinked. He was tempted to say that if he'd known the Chitauri invasion would be this pathetic, he wouldn't have been so worried. But, Hawk's gaze returned to his surroundings. He looked at the utter devastation, the war-torn ruins of his neighborhood, where he could still see the mangled remains of his neighbors. He swallowed the thought. It wasn't that the Chitauri were weak. It was that he had become strong. If I hadn't awakened my Cosmo at this exact moment, a piece of me would probably be lying in that wreckage right now. Hawk's eyes fell on the gruesome remains scattered across the rubble. The thought solidified his resolve. He had to get stronger. And keep getting stronger. Not for fame, not for glory, but for one simple reason. For the right to say one single sentence. My fate is my own. But for now, Hawk had a more immediate problem to deal with. Namely, finding a safe place to stash the 5 alien weapons he had just earned from his hard work, and then figuring out how to sell them for enough cash to improve his life. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 17 comments 0 vote. 9 Homeowners insurance. Alien invasion is an act of God. Bonus. Thank you for 100 power stones. Here's your bonus chapter. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. The Chitauri came. The Chitauri left. They left behind Loki, the mastermind of the invasion, a number of their soldiers who didn't make it back through the portal, and a New York City in utter ruins. The good news. Loki was in custody. Even the Chitauri soldiers left on Earth had collapsed the moment their connection to the mothership was severed, dropping like puppets with their strings cut. The second the wormhole snapped shut, the Chitauri still swarming the skies over New York simply powered down and fell from the sky, one after another, like stones. Clearly. In this sudden war for the planet, Earth had emerged victorious. The bad news. New York City was severely damaged. The 5-block radius around Stark Tower was hit the hardest. That had been the main battlefield, and it was almost completely leveled. Other parts of Manhattan had sustained less damage, but that was only in comparison to Ground Zero. Compared to the rest of the city, the damage was still catastrophic. Beyond that, the outer boroughs had their own scars. With one major exception. We have a situation in Queens, Jackson Heights. An entire city block has been practically wiped off the map by the Chitauri. Aboard the helicarrier, Commander Maria Hill, dressed in her tactical gear, was reviewing the satellite imagery of New York. Her voice came through the comms of the original Avengers, who were just starting to celebrate Iron Man's revival. It's strange. The attack seems highly concentrated. That one block in Jackson Heights was hit with a full-scale carpet bombing. Intel suggests the Chitauri forces in Queens were enraged by something and converged on that location. The Avengers, still standing amidst the wreckage of the main battlefield, exchanged confused looks. Captain America was the first to speak. Why? We don't know, Captain. Agents are en route to investigate now. Maria Hill's voice was all business. Her tone then shifted slightly. All Chitauri life signs have been extinguished. Congratulations, Captain. We won. As her words sank in, a collective sigh of relief went through the Avengers. They looked at each other. And then, tired, bruised smiles broke out on their faces. That night, it wasn't just the New York City news channels. It was every channel in the country, and around the world. The Chitauri invasion was the only story. Without a doubt, the original Avengers, the heroes who had fought on the front lines, were now public figures. Captain America, Steve Rogers. Iron Man, Tony Stark. Thor, the God of Thunder. Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff. The Hulk, Bruce Banner. Hawkeye, Clint Barton. The legitimate news networks reported the details of the battle. The less reputable ones ran sensationalized specials on the heroes' backstories and rumored love lives. The most popular topic, by far, was the confirmed return of Captain America, Steve Rogers. He had reappeared after being presumed dead for decades, looking exactly the same. After all, Captain America was a national symbol. His popularity was already sky high. Now, with his dramatic return from the dead, his celebrity had exploded. Hawk was currently eating a relief meal handed out by a local church group, watching an old 18-inch TV that was playing a documentary about Captain America's secret history. He had no choice. His apartment building was now a pile of rubble. It wasn't just him, or just the people from his building. Technically, everyone who lived on his block was now homeless. About half an hour after the battle ended, their entire street had been cordoned off by a group of men in black suits and black ties. Some residents who tried to go back and salvage their belongings from the wreckage were turned away. The official reason: federal emergency zone. No entry. Fortunately, the agency that sealed off the block took pity on them. They were provided with temporary shelter in an unused hangar at LaGuardia Airport, and local churches were brought in to provide free food. But, as Hawk was chewing on a piece of dry bread and listening to the TV, he heard a sniffling sound next to him. He turned his head. He saw a large, burly man, probably in his mid-30s, hugging his knees to his chest, his face buried between his legs. The quiet sobs quickly escalated into full-blown, gut-wrenching wails. Another survivor nearby couldn't help but ask, "Hey, what's wrong? My house, it's gone. It's okay." The other man, relieved it wasn't something worse, tried to comfort him. "Don't worry, we have insurance." He shouldn't have said that. At the mention of insurance, the man began to cry even harder. Now the other survivor was completely lost. "What is it now? You didn't have insurance." "No, I did. Then, I just called my insurance company," the man choked out between sobs, looking up at the other survivor. They said an alien invasion falls under the act of God clause. It's not covered." The other survivor's face froze. "What? Not covered? No way. How can they not pay out? Shit, I gotta make a call." Quote. Hearing this exchange, the other survivors in the hangar immediately scrambled for their phones, frantically dialing their own insurance companies. About a minute later, a second person started crying. Then a third. A fourth. In the blink of an eye, the entire hangar was filled with the sounds of people realizing they were about to be homeless. Hawk, now surrounded by a chorus of despair, felt a lump form in his throat. His apartment was gone, and insurance wasn't paying. But then, he stopped. Wait a minute. That apartment was federal housing. And it was going to be taken away next year anyway when he turned 18. That was the whole reason he'd been saving up, why he had over $30,000 stashed away. Once he turned 18, the government would kick him out of the system in the name of independence. After all, at 18, he would legally be an adult in the state of New York, and no longer eligible for juvenile orphan benefits. What's that? You don't have money for rent. Sorry, not our problem. There are plenty of homeless people under the bridges and in the subway tunnels of New York City. You can try asking them if they mind sharing. So, I don't even own a house. The insurance company not paying out has absolutely nothing to do with me. Hawk snapped out of it. He looked at the faces of the other survivors, which were twisting with grief and rage. A thought occurred to him, and he quietly got to his feet and started walking toward the hangar exit. He was suddenly afraid there was about to be a riot. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 11 comments, 0 vote. 10 on the subject of forging a saint armor in the Marvel Universe. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. 5 days later. Midtown School of Science and Technology. The physics teacher was lecturing at the front of the classroom. Down below, Hawk sat in his usual seat by the window, jotting down a few words in his notebook. Orichalcum, Yaminium, and Stardust Sand. Individually, these names meant nothing to most people. But together, they meant only one thing. Saint armor. The combat gear of the saints. When worn, it allowed a saint to connect with their guardian constellation, dramatically amplifying their power. And to forge a saint armor, these 3 materials were essential. The good news. Since he was the only person in this universe with a Cosmo, he wouldn't have to literally forge the armor himself. He just needed to find the three materials, and his guardian constellation would automatically refine them into his own unique saint armor. The bad news. Who the hell was going to tell him how to find materials from the Saint Seiya universe inside the Marvel universe? Hawk felt a headache coming on. Fortunately, he still had time. He hadn't even ignited a single guardian constellation yet, so the need for an armor wasn't urgent. But it was always better to be prepared. Rather than waiting until he'd awakened a constellation to start searching, he might as well start planning now. So, Hawk looked at the word, orichalcum, in his notebook. After a moment of thought, he wrote another word next to it. Vibranium. Orichalcum, one of the three core components of a saint armor, was a legendary alloy from ancient Greek mythology, said to be capable of resisting any normal impact. Coincidentally, vibranium was a legendary alloy in the Marvel universe. In fact, it was the top-tier alloy. And vibranium also possessed the property of absorbing and negating kinetic energy indefinitely. Captain America's shield was forged from it. One of a kind. Unparalleled in the world. As a metal that existed only in whispers and legends, vibranium was something money couldn't buy. But Hawk knew of a place in the world where vibranium was abundant. A place with reserves so vast, it would probably be enough to forge all 48 bronze, 24 silver, and 12 gold armors, with plenty left over. That's right. He was talking about Wakanda, the nation that was still isolationist in the 21st century, all while pretending to be a starving third world country to get relief aid from the UN. If vibranium really could be a substitute for orichalcum, then Hawk had to have it. What's that? Wakanda won't give it to him. Hey, my need for vibranium has nothing to do with you. He wasn't a warmonger, but if anyone stood in the way of him getting stronger, that was a fundamental conflict. And in a conflict like that, there was no backing down. With that thought, Hawk's eyes moved to stardust sand in his notebook. He paused, then wrote the word meteorite next to it. Stardust sand. The name was self-explanatory, sand ground from the stars of the galaxy. Meteorites were, quite literally, fallen stars. If he could find a meteorite, he could use the energy from his burning Cosmo to crush it into stardust sand. But gamanium. What the hell was this stuff? If orichalcum provided the armor's metallic properties and stardust sand granted it the ability to self-repair, then gamanium was the catalyst, the agent that fused the other two materials and, most importantly, imbued the armor with a life of its own. In a word, orichalcum and stardust sand weren't the true key to forging a saint armor. Gamanium was. Without it, an armor made from the other two would be nothing more than an inert, lifeless shell. Only with gamanium could it become a true, living battle suit for a saint. But Hawk's brow furrowed. After a moment of deep thought, he wrote, gamma radiation, next to the word, then drew a small question mark. Based on its ability to grant life to the armor, and the obvious, gamma, in its name, it seemed almost certain to be related to the mother of the Hulk, gamma radiation. The Hulk was born when Bruce Banner was exposed to a massive dose of gamma rays. From a biological standpoint, gamma radiation was the Hulk's mother. Of course, if Bruce Banner had been a woman, then it could have been the Hulk's father. The point was, even if gamma radiation wasn't gamanium itself, there was almost certainly a crucial connection between the two. Hawk closed his eyes, the tip of his pen tapping unconsciously on the notebook as he thought. Just then, he felt a nudge. Hawk opened his eyes and looked at Gwen, who had just nudged him with her elbow. Mr. Anderson is calling on you. Quote. Hawk blinked, then looked up toward the front of the class. Mr. Anderson, his hair starting to gray at the temples, smiled as Hawk met his gaze. Hawk, would you care to answer the question for us? Great. Busted for daydreaming. But Hawk stood up from his seat, and after only a moment of thought, he gave a perfect answer to Mr. Anderson's question. Now it was Mr. Anderson's turn to be stunned. However, since Hawk's answer was correct, the teacher just gave him a look that said, "You got lucky this time," and told him to sit down. Hawk said a quick, "Thank you," and took his seat. Just as he was about to dive back into the puzzle of gamanium and gamma radiation, a small, folded piece of paper was slid onto his desk. Hawk unfolded it and read the note. In neat, cursive handwriting, it said, "Is your court hearing for your emancipation petition confirmed? It is. This afternoon." Hawk thought for a second, then wrote his reply below her question and slid the note back. Since his apartment had been demolished by aliens, a new placement in the foster care system had yet to be arranged. But Hawk figured he'd never get one anyway. The New York City bureaucracy was notoriously slow, and he wasn't the only orphan who had been displaced. He estimated that by the time his name came up, it would be next year. And next year, he'd be 18. So, Hawk had been spending his time looking for a cheap apartment to rent. He couldn't keep living like a refugee, crammed into a smelly hangar with hundreds of other people. Not to mention, he was constantly worried that one of the people who'd lost everything would snap. He had to move out next year anyway. He might as well just do it now. But since he was still a minor, legally, no one would rent to him. That was why he had been taking the afternoons off to go to the Queen's family court and file a petition for early emancipation. And since he'd been leaving early, Gwen knew why. It wasn't that Hawk had told her. He wasn't that sociable. Simply put, Hawk was a student. Gwen was the student aide. And she was the student aide for his grade. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators thoughts. 6 comments 0 vote. 11, smart, kind, and drop dead gorgeous. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Inside the old gymnasium. Even though Hawk had already awakened his Cosmo, the habit of throwing 10,000 punches a day for 1,000 straight days wasn't something he could just drop overnight. So, he'd kept up the routine. Besides, he had nothing better to do. More importantly, he could feel that with each day of training, another star within his Cosmo had begun to glow faintly. It hadn't fully ignited yet, but he estimated that if he kept this up for another month, it would. Clearly, combat wasn't the only way to awaken his constellations. It was just the fastest. Compared to the slow grind of a month of training to ignite a single star, fighting was a shortcut. But that didn't matter. Hawk wasn't in a hurry. First, he didn't see himself as some kind of violence-addicted maniac. He certainly wasn't going to be one of those guys who gets powers and the very next day decides he's too good for humanity. 1,000 days of 10,000 punches had forged more than just his strength, it had forged his character. He controlled his power. The power did not control him. Second, he hadn't even gathered the materials to forge a saint armor yet. There was no rush to light up his constellations. Everyone knows the score. A saint without their armor and a saint with their armor are two completely different species. Well, for the most part, anyway. A little while later. After a quick shower, Hawk changed into a new t-shirt and jeans. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, walked out of the old gym, and headed for the main school gate. His emancipation hearing was scheduled for 3:30 this afternoon. If he caught the bus from the school gate now and made a couple of transfers, he could probably get to the courthouse by 3. Hawk sat at the bus stop outside the school, eating a sandwich and waiting. He watched the various cars coming and going from the school entrance and started to wonder if he should get a car himself. Of course, before he could do that, he'd need to get his driver's license. That's right. Unlike most of the kids in his grade, who all seemed to have their licenses, he didn't. He'd never even considered buying a car before. But now, the thought had taken root. Before he awakened his Cosmo, he couldn't afford to. He had to plan for his future. Once he turned 18, the federal aid would stop. He'd have to cover rent on his own, and eventually, student loans for college. The pressure of his future was suffocating. Buying a car. Was he worthy? No. He probably wouldn't even be able to afford the insurance premiums. But things were different now. If there was one thing Hawk felt after awakening his Cosmo, it was an immense sense of relief. The weight of his uncertain future had been completely lifted. After all, barring any unforeseen accidents, his future now had only 2 possibilities. Living comfortably, or living very comfortably. In fact, if he were a little darker, a little more ruthless, he could use his power and a saint armor to live like an emperor, where those who followed him prospered, and those who opposed him perished. Power is strength. Strength is in the fist. And his fists were already sonic. Soon, they would be faster than light. But he didn't have that kind of ambition. He certainly had no desire to become some kind of detached godking. At least, not right now. But with the pressure of the future gone, Hawk figured he could afford to upgrade his quality of life a bit. For starters, he still had 5 Chitauri weapons stashed away, waiting for the right opportunity to be sold. Even if he sold them cheap, say, $20,000 a pop, that was still $100,000. So, buying a car to make his life a little easier didn't seem so out of reach anymore. As Hawk was lost in thought, he started to wonder why the bus was taking so long. Just then, a yellow Toyota Corolla with the custom license plate, GW521, pulled up in front of him. The window rolled down. Gwen Stacy, her blonde hair tied back casually, her face framed by sharp, intelligent features and a pair of blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, looked out at him. Get in. Quote. Hawk looked at Gwen, who was now waving him over. After a moment's silence, he said, "It's okay, I can just wait for the bus." "Thanks, though." Gwen smiled. "You sure? The buses aren't running today." "They're not." Hawk blinked, confused. "When? Why?" "Since noon." Gwen's smile widened. "The MTA is on strike. Haven't you noticed you're the only one at the bus stop?" Hawk instinctively looked around. She was right. The entire bus stop was empty, except for him. Damn it. Hawk took a deep breath. He looked at Gwen, who was still smiling at him from the driver's seat. After a moment, he stood up, grabbed his backpack from the bench, walked to the car, and opened the passenger door. "I owe you one. Thanks. Don't mention it," Gwen said. Once Hawk was inside, she hit the gas, and the car sped off, heading toward the Queens County Courthouse. "Oh, by the way." As she was driving, Gwen remembered something. She glanced at Hawk in the passenger seat. "They changed the judge for your hearing. It's Judge Burroughs now. They also moved the time up to 3 o'clock. Quote. A question mark slowly formed over Hawk's head. He looked at Gwen, confused. Gwen smiled slightly. "The contact number you listed was the school's. The guidance counselor couldn't find you. I saw you heading to the old gym at lunch, so I figured you'd probably be waiting here for the bus." It clicked. Hawk nodded in understanding. A moment later, it hit him again. He looked at Gwen, who was focused on the road, and said another "thank you." "Thanks. Seriously. Again, don't mention it." Gwen replied with another smile. "I'm the grade student aide. It's my job to help students." And that was the truth. At Midtown Tech, Gwen Stacy was universally known for being smart, kind, and beautiful. She would patiently help any student who came to her with a question. Like Jessica. She would even help Flash Thompson when he occasionally, and reluctantly, asked for it. Gwen would also stand up for students who were being bullied. Like Peter. She had even stepped in to defend another girl, Maria, from the head cheerleader. And on top of all that, Gwen was at the top of her class. So, smart, kind, and drop-dead gorgeous. That was Gwen Stacy in a nutshell. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Bonus chapter every 100 PS. If you like the story, please leave a review. Add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators thoughts. 10 comments 0 vote. 12 from this day forward, Mr. Hawk bonus. Thank you for 200 power stones, here's your bonus chapter. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. If you were to rank the most popular girls at Midtown Tech, Gwen might not have the most rabid fanbase, but she would absolutely be number 1. In fact, she'd probably be in a league of her own. The silent majority of the student body would cast their vote for Gwen. That included Hawk. He still remembered when he first started at Midtown. He was quiet, a bit of a loner, and Gwen had mistaken his solitude for him being ostracized by other students. She had even tried to help him fit in. But that was just Gwen being kind. Hawk never misinterpreted her concern as anything more. She would have done the same for any other student. She was just a genuinely good person. Besides, what was that famous saying? Right. Life's 3 biggest delusions. And chief among them, the undisputed champion, is the delusion, she's into me. So, Hawk was under no such illusions. Soon. They arrived at the Queens County Courthouse. Hawk looked at the building, then turned to Gwen and thanked her again for the ride before getting out of the car. And then, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Gwen getting out of the car and following him. A question mark appeared over his head once again. Quote. How are you planning on getting back? Gwen asked. You're not going to walk, are you? The airport is miles from here. The transit union is on strike. Subway operators are still transit workers. Quote. Hawk fell silent. Gwen just smiled and started walking toward the courthouse. Come on, it's almost 3. You don't want Judge Burroughs to cancel your hearing, do you? Hawk watched her walk ahead of him, opened his mouth to say something, then thought better of it. He shook his head and followed. Family Court, Courtroom 3. Judge Burroughs, presiding from the bench, tapped his gavel lightly. Next, the emancipation petition of Hawk. Your Honor. Hawk rose from his seat and gave a respectful nod to the judge. Your Honor. The social worker from the Administration for Children's Services assigned to Hawk's case also stood. Judge Burroughs reviewed the documents Hawk had submitted with his petition. After a moment, he looked up at the social worker. I see here he's never been adopted, nor placed with a foster family. The social worker gave a weary smile. That's correct, Your Honor. May I ask why? Hawk was different from the other children. Even when he was young, he was quiet and didn't socialize much. As a result, prospective parents never considered him. That's why he's remained in the system for so long. Hawk. Judge Burroughs nodded after hearing the social worker's explanation. He then looked at Hawk, who, despite his quiet nature, didn't seem aloof or withdrawn. I see in your petition that you're seeking emancipation in order to rent an apartment. Hawk nodded. Yes, Your Honor. May I ask how you plan to pay for this rent, should you be granted independence? I have $30,000 saved in my bank account. If I'm just renting a cheap apartment, that's more than enough to cover my expenses until I can find a job. 30,000. Quote. Judge Burroughs' eyes widened slightly. He flipped through the file until he found the bank statement Hawk had submitted, then cross-referenced it with the other documents. A look of disbelief crossed his face. No phone. No computer. No car, not even a driver's license. Judge Burroughs was genuinely surprised. It wasn't unheard of for minors in the system to petition for early emancipation. But he had never seen a case like Hawk's, where a kid had cut out every single non-essential expense. More than that, he had never seen an unadopted, unfostered orphan with a savings account containing a sum as substantial as $30,000. Judge Burroughs looked at Hawk, his tone shifting. You have a remarkable amount of self-control, Mr. Hawk. Thank you, Your Honor. Hawk's heart skipped a beat when he heard the judge use the honorific. Mr. was a title reserved for independent, adult men. Just as he thought. Judge Burroughs smiled, then brought a stamp down on Hawk's petition with a satisfying thump. He handed the document to the bailiff next to him. Normally, I'm hesitant to grant early emancipation. The adult world can be a cruel place. But you, Mr. Hawk, I believe you are more than prepared. So, congratulations. Hawk took the stamped document from the bailiff, his eyes meeting the judge's. Thank you. You've earned it. Judge Burroughs gave him a final nod, then tapped his gavel again. Next case. Hawk and Gwen left the courtroom. Outside the courthouse. Hawk looked down at the document in his hand, now bearing the official seal of the court, and smiled. With this, he was legally an independent adult. Even though he wasn't yet 18, he could now legally sign a lease. He could finally move out of that powder keg of a hangar. And that was a very good thing. Feeling a sense of accomplishment, Hawk started walking toward the subway station. The next second, a hand grabbed his arm. Hawk looked up to see Gwen giving him an exasperated look. He blinked, and then it hit him. Right. The subway isn't running either. Sorry. Come on. Gwen shook her head, then a playful smile touched her lips. She looked at Hawk and added, Mr. Hawk. Hawk raised an eyebrow at her teasing tone as she turned and walked toward where she had parked her car. A traffic cop was standing in front of her yellow Corolla. Just a second, officer. Gwen, seeing the cop was already writing a ticket, rushed over. She quickly dug through her bag and pulled out a small card. The officer looked up, a bit surprised, as Gwen handed it to him. It wasn't a business card, but a family courtesy card, the kind issued to the families of NYPD officers. The officer looked at the card, noted the name and number, 19th Precinct, George Stacy, then looked back at Gwen. He holstered his ticket machine and handed the card back. Have a nice day. Thank you, officer. Gwen said with a relieved sigh. The officer got back on his police motorcycle and rode off with a roar. Gwen watched him go, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Hawk, her voice laced with relief. That was close. Quote. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Hash bonus chapter every 100 PS. Hash if you like the story, please leave a review. Hash add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators thoughts. 13 comments 0 vote. 13 The beginning of Hawk and Gwen. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Traffic tickets in New York City aren't outrageously expensive. But there's one key difference from how things work in other countries. Here, a traffic violation is treated like a minor criminal offense. In other places, you might just pay a fine, get some points on your license, and be done with it. Here, you have to waste a day in traffic court. So, as Gwen started the car and began the drive back to LaGuardia Airport, she was still feeling relieved that she'd gotten out there in time. Otherwise, she'd have had to take a day off school just to deal with it. At the same time, she was still a little confused. It's so weird. You can park right in front of the courthouses in Manhattan. Why not in Queens? Quote. Sitting in the passenger seat, Hawk listened to Gwen thinking out loud. After a moment, a thought occurred to him. Even if you got a ticket, couldn't you just have Captain Stacy take care of it? Gwen snapped out of her thoughts and glanced at Hawk, then shook her head. No way. Hawk remembered the courtesy card Gwen had just shown the traffic cop. Gwen seemed to read his mind and explained with a smile, using the family card is fine. Everyone does it. It's one of the unofficial perks for police families. But getting an actual ticket is different. My dad would never call in a favor with one of his friends at the courthouse over a parking violation. He'd just give me a very serious look and say, Gwen, you need to stand before the court and take responsibility for your actions. As she explained, Gwen perfectly mimicked the stern tone and expression of George Stacy of the NYPD's 19th precinct. Hawk listened to her explanation and nodded in understanding. He had always pictured George Stacy as one of those old-school, by-the-book cops who didn't bend the rules for anyone. But from the way Gwen described him, that didn't seem to be the case. Movies always rely on stereotypes. 45 minutes later. Gwen pulled up to the curb at LaGuardia Airport. Hawk unbuckled his seatbelt and thanked her one more time as she put the car in park. Just as he was about to open his door and get out, Gwen spoke up. I'm curious about something, Hawk. Hawk, who had already pushed the door open, turned back to look at her. What? If I didn't accept your thank you, what would you do? Just keep saying it. Quote. Gwen's question left Hawk speechless. After a moment, he looked at her smiling face, which seemed genuinely curious about his answer, and thought about it. Sorry. Quote. Now it was Gwen's turn to be silent. If I don't accept your thanks, you apologize. Sure, why not? Gwen's smile grew wider. She looked at Hawk and said, You say, thank you, way too much. We're friends. Friends don't have to say thank you all the time. Friends. Hawk was taken aback again. He and Gwen were friendlier than he was with most other students, but that was mainly because they shared a physics class and sat next to each other. But that was it. Outside of physics, they barely interacted at school. To be fair, he barely interacted with any student. But Hawk didn't argue. She had just given him a ride all the way out here. The last thing he was going to do was tell her they weren't friends. He wasn't a complete social idiot. Soon after he got out, Gwen made a U-turn, hit the gas, and disappeared from view. Hawk watched her car go, then turned and walked toward the temporary shelter. That evening, Manhattan. The Goring Building. Helen Stacy was lounging on the sofa in her pajamas, watching the latest episode of Desperate Housewives. She heard the front door open and turned to look. Her husband, George Stacy of the 19th precinct, walked in, dressed in a black suit, his badge clipped to his belt. You're home. Yes. George replied, closing the door behind him. He looked at Helen on the sofa. Where's Gwen? Helen glanced toward the stairs. In her room. Oh. George nodded and headed upstairs. He knocked lightly on his daughter's door. Gwen. Gwen's voice came from inside. It's not locked, Dad. George pushed the door open. Inside, Gwen was already in her pajamas, a cute matching set. Her long, blonde hair was down, and she was sitting cross-legged on her desk chair. She looked up as her father came in. What's up, Dad? George didn't come into the room. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, a knowing smile on his face. So, you skipped your afternoon classes today. Gwen froze for a second, then it clicked. She uncrossed her legs and stood up. Did someone call you? What do you think? George chuckled. They have to call and verify. Make sure it wasn't someone using a fake family card. It was unlikely, but there was a saying in the department, you can be an idiot, but you can't be a boring idiot. People had tried to fake the cards before. It was rare, but it happened. Since calling to verify on the spot could be awkward, the protocol was to just jot down the plate number and confirm it back at the precinct. If the card was legit, no problem. If it was a fake, well, that was also no problem. They had the plate number. The driver could look forward to a dozen tickets in their mailbox the next day. The NYPD made sure that anyone who tried to pull a fast one paid the price. Gwen sighed. Dad, I really didn't mean to park there. You can park right in front of the courthouses in Manhattan. George shrugged. I'm not interested in your parking violation. That's what the family card is for. He wasn't that much of a hardass. The card was meant to be used. Just not abused. Gwen blinked. Then why? Why were you at the Queens County Courthouse this afternoon? Oh. Gwen sat back down in her chair and picked up the book she had been reading. It was nothing. I just gave a classmate a ride to the courthouse for something. George's smile widened. A male classmate. Quote. Gwen put down her book and looked at her father, her expression serious. Dad, Hawk and I are just friends. No, that's not right. That guy seems to actively resist the idea of being my friend. Gwen thought to herself. She remembered the look on Hawk's face that afternoon when she'd told him they were friends, that fleeting, almost pained expression of stiffness. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. If you're interested, you can read advanced chapters. Web links. #bonus chapter every 100 ps. If you like the story, please leave a review. #add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. 14. The Phoenix Doesn't Die, it's Reborn bonus. Thank you for 300 power stones, here's your bonus chapter. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. The next day. Since it was Saturday, Hawk got an early start and headed over to an apartment building across from Queensbridge Park. This was his new home. It hadn't taken long to find. A nice, affordable apartment was hard to come by, but a cheap one was easy enough to find. Even so, no landlord would rent to a minor, especially one who couldn't provide a guarantor. But, when Hawk explained that he had already petitioned the court for emancipation, the landlord had agreed to wait. And now, here he was. After seeing the court-stamped document confirming Hawk's legal independence, the landlord didn't waste any time. They signed the lease, Hawk paid 6 months' rent up front, and the keys were handed over. The deal was done. Once the landlord left, Hawk closed the door and took a look around his new place. It wasn't any bigger than his last one. To put it dramatically, it looked like a cardboard box that life had stepped on. The carpet was old, the walls were stained. The living room was pathetically small, with a second-hand sofa and a folding dining table, you had to be careful just to turn around. The bedroom was the same. Once he'd put a bed in, there would be no extra space. But it was small, but it had everything he needed. Most importantly, just like his old place, this apartment had a fire escape outside the window with direct access to the rooftop. That was the main reason Hawk had asked the landlord to give him time to sort things out with the court. Besides, for $700 a month in New York City, what more could you ask for? Hawk spent the next 2 days cleaning and setting up his new apartment. Setting up was a generous term. He bought a new mattress and replaced the old, yellowed showerhead in the bathroom. He also left the windows open for 2 full days to air the place out, finally getting rid of the lingering smell of stale curry. Of course, he didn't forget his treasure. Under the cover of night, he went to his hiding spot and retrieved his spoils of war, the 5 Chitauri weapons, and brought them back to his new home. He wrapped them in the bedsheet that had come with his old apartment's bed and stashed them underneath his new one. That evening, just like he used to, Hawk bought a burger and a Coke from a place downstairs. He then climbed the fire escape to the roof of his new building. After looking around, he found a relatively clean spot and sat down. He ate his burger while gazing up at the stars. As a few stars flickered in the night sky, the stars within his own Cosmo mirrored their light. Hawk had already decided which bronze constellation he would ignite first. Not Pegasus. Not Cygnus. And not Draco. It would be the Phoenix. A constellation wasn't just a container for a saint's power, it was a mark of their legacy. Once a saint awakened their Cosmo and claimed their guardian constellation, they inherited the core attributes of that constellation. And in Hawk's opinion, among all 48 bronze constellations, none had an attribute that could compare to that of the Phoenix. Because the Phoenix possessed a quality that not even the 12 gold zodiacs had. The Phoenix doesn't die, it's reborn. If the core of the Draco constellation was the might of the dragon, and the dragon's guard, then the core of the Phoenix was immortality and rebirth. The bad news. Because the Phoenix's core attribute was so ridiculously overpowered, the requirements to become the Phoenix Saint were incredibly demanding. In the old stories, from the very first Holy War, the Phoenix Saint was a position that had remained vacant among Athena's 88 saints, only appearing for the first time in the modern era. The good news. This wasn't that universe. The Phoenix constellation here wasn't nearly as picky. The second he finished lighting up the star chart for the Phoenix in his Cosmo, he would gain its core attribute. His life force would reach a terrifying new level. Even if he were killed, he wouldn't truly die. As long as the Phoenix constellation existed, he would be reborn from the ashes, rising from the flames to return. So, he'd have to be insane to choose any other constellation over the Phoenix. After all, his core mission hadn't changed. Survive. And if possible, live comfortably, and live for a very long time. Having made his choice, Hawk didn't hesitate. He focused his will, directing the 12 stars he had ignited by killing the Chitauri. He began to arrange them within his Cosmo, forming the pattern of the Phoenix constellation. The Phoenix constellation is composed of 1 second magnitude star, 2/3 magnitude stars, and 6/4 magnitude stars. The stars Hawk had ignited by killing the Chitauri were the smallest kind, 4th magnitude. It took 2/4 magnitude stars to form a 3rd magnitude star, and 2/3 magnitude stars to form a 2nd magnitude. So, still need 2 more. Not bad. This is good. Hawk took a sip of his soda, a smile on his face as he looked at the nearly completed Phoenix star chart glowing brightly in his inner universe. Only 2 stars left to go. Just then, the ghostly outlines of the other 47 bronze constellations flickered within his Cosmo. For some reason, Hawk felt a wave of resentment from them, a silent protest. But amidst their complaints, he heard the faint cry of a phoenix. And with that cry, the protests of the other 47 constellations vanished. Hawk blinked, looking at the Phoenix star chart in his Cosmo. The mostly completed constellation seemed to radiate a palpable arrogance, like a true phoenix looking down on the other 47 constellations. Clearly, as Hawk's first choice, the proud phoenix was now even prouder. Quote. A corner of Hawk's mouth twitched. He decided not to linger on it and withdrew from his Cosmo, climbing back down the fire escape into his new apartment. A little while later. Lying in bed, not yet asleep, Hawk closed his eyes and once again turned his thoughts to the Saint armor. Igniting the Phoenix constellation would grant him the core of the undying Phoenix. But forging and wearing the Phoenix armor would unlock the constellation's exclusive powers and abilities. For example, the Phoenix Illusion Demon Fist, a technique that shattered an enemy's mind, not their body. A psychic assault that allowed him to directly invade an enemy's mindscape and tear their psyche to shreds with his own superior mental fortitude. And there was one more. The ultimate technique, the exclusive secret art of the Phoenix, where he would become the Phoenix itself, unleashing a powerful, scorching wave of air like the beating of its wings, capable of annihilating all in its path. The Phoenix's wing descent. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. If you're interested, you can read advanced chapters. Web links. #bonus chapter every 100 ps. If you like the story, please leave a review. #add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading. DragonnX creators' thoughts. 13 comments 0 vote. 15 The Boy Who Dreamed of Being a Lawyer bonus. Thank you for 400 power stones, here's your bonus chapter. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. Better to act than to just think about it. The Phoenix constellation was only 2 stars away from completion. It was only a matter of time. Even if he didn't get into any more fights, at his current training pace of 10,000 punches a day, he could probably ignite the remaining 2 stars in less than 3 months. But Hawk was still completely stumped when it came to the Saint armor. More specifically, he had no leads on gammonium. The other 2 materials were manageable. Theoretically, as long as he had enough money, he could just buy them. Take the meteorites needed to create stardust sand, for example. There were plenty of wealthy meteorite collectors in New York City alone, not to mention the various trade shows and conventions that happened regularly. So, if he was willing to spend the money, he could get his hands on one. And while vibranium was technically priceless, that was fine. He knew where it came from. If vibranium was the final piece of the puzzle and its owners refused to cooperate, he had no problem seizing it himself. Again, my need for vibranium has nothing to do with you. So that left only one problem. Gammonium. For the past few days, after his classes, Hawk had been camping out in the library, checking out every book he could find on gamma radiation and using the public computers to search for more information online. As a side benefit, he'd also learned who the biggest meteorite collector in New York City was. Norman Osborn. That's right. The very same Norman Osborn of Oscorp Industries, the man who becomes a major villain in the Spider-Man story. Hawk had found a post on a meteorite enthusiast forum from a month ago. According to the post, Norman Osborn had an entire room in his mansion dedicated to the meteorites he had collected over the years. He'd even found information on the Wakandan ambassador to the United Nations. The ambassador was based right here in New York City, since the UN headquarters was here. So, Hawk had leads on the meteorite and the vibranium. But the final, and most crucial ingredient, gammonium, was still a complete mystery. Right now, Hawk was monopolizing one of the library computers, continuing his search. If you had to name the one person in the Marvel Universe who knew the most about gamma radiation, it would undoubtedly be the father of the Hulk himself, Dr. Bruce Banner. Unfortunately, even if Hawk wanted to find him, he couldn't. After the Battle of New York, Dr. Banner had ridden off on a scooter and disappeared. S.H.I.E.L.D. probably knew where he was. But Hawk wanted nothing to do with superheroes, let alone S.H.I.E.L.D., an organization that was practically synonymous with trouble. It wasn't a huge problem, though. Dr. Banner wasn't the only person who studied gamma radiation. There were others, even if they weren't as knowledgeable. Like the author of the paper Hawk had just found. On the application of gamma radiation in the field of bioregeneration. Dr. Kurt Connors. Oscorp Industries. Hiss. Isn't that the lizard? The name clicked. Hawk stared at the title of the paper on the screen and blinked. Oh, you're reading Dr. Connors's paper. Quote. A familiar voice pulled Hawk from his thoughts. He turned his head. Standing right behind him was Gwen. She was holding a book, a few strands of blonde hair falling across her forehead as she leaned in to look at his screen. On the application of gamma. Gwen read the title, then looked at Hawk with a curious expression. I thought you wanted to go to NYU for law school. What's with the sudden interest in gamma radiation? No, that was just a way to make money. Hawk answered in his head. Before his power awakened, he had set a clear goal for himself. Study law. His first choice had actually been medicine. In some parts of the world, doctors were expected to be humble public servants. If a doctor lived in a mansion and drove a sports car, they were probably corrupt. But not here. Not in America. Here, if a doctor didn't live in a mansion and drive a nice car, people would probably assume they were a bad doctor. So, a successful doctor, especially a surgeon, could make a fortune. But Hawk had given up on that idea pretty quickly. The reason was simple. He didn't think he had the aptitude for it. So, he had settled for the next best thing, becoming a lawyer. Lawyers did just as well as doctors. And more importantly, after law school, if he didn't want to work for a firm, he could go into public service, maybe become a prosecutor, or even a judge someday. But that was the path he had planned for himself before he awakened his Cosmo, a path designed to make his future a little easier. He didn't need it anymore. He still planned on going to college, he wasn't going to get lazy, but the desperate need to study law was gone. Hawk shook his head with a slight smile and turned to Gwen. Just browsing. Stumbled upon it by accident. He closed the web page, stood up, and let someone else have the computer. It was time to head to the old gym for his daily 10,000 punch routine. He couldn't help it. After more than 2 years, a day without training just felt incomplete. Gwen watched Hawk leave the library, a thoughtful expression on her face. A moment later, one of her friends nudged her, and they went to find a table to study. Summer break was just around the corner, which meant that starting tomorrow, Midtown Tech would be entering the most dreaded time of the year for slackers, finals week. Every school had them. Midtown Tech was no exception. Aside from a few scholarship students, most of the kids here were paying tens of thousands of dollars in tuition each semester. And that was the demographic where you found most of the slackers. So, for the past few days, the library had been filled with the sight of normally hyperactive students suddenly cramming, their noses buried in textbooks. Hawk didn't need to. He hadn't needed to cram before his Cosmo awakened, and he certainly didn't need to now. His future was set. His only two options were, comfortable, and, more comfortable. So, Hawk stuck to his usual routine. Inside the old gymnasium. Hawk was focused, throwing punch after punch. The squeal of the gym door opening cut through the silence, and a familiar, radiant figure walked in. The school board said they're tearing this place down after the break. They're turning it into a swimming pool. Crack. Hawk's fist slammed into the heavy bag in front of him. The bag didn't swing. It didn't even move. It just shuddered violently, and a cloud of dust exploded from its surface. The midday sun streamed in through the grimy windows of the old gymnasium. It illuminated the scene perfectly. Less than greater than 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 less than greater than. If you're interested, you can read advanced chapters. Web links. #bonus chapter every 100 ps. If you like the story, please leave a review. #add to library. If you're enjoying the story, please drop some power stones, they really help with new chapter releases. A short review would also be deeply appreciated. Thanks for reading.